think we should begin for everyone who's made it here so far. I'd like to start with a story of how the idea for this webinar began. I was in a coaching session with the head of HR, and he had received some pretty direct feedback from his colleagues that his interpersonal skills were severely lacking. His team overwhelmingly agreed that he did not listen well or respond appropriately to others, but he was not convinced. He told me, in fact, that he had massive EQ. It was an odd choice of words, but more importantly, the issue at hand was, how do I help him bridge the gap in his perception between how he sees himself versus a very different picture of how others see him? My name is Kate Modick. I'm an associate director here at Peterberry Consultancy, and I have the massive privilege of being joined by our director of coaching services, Lee Wallace, to talk about some of the research around self-awareness and why coaching is such an effective way to increase self-awareness. Say hi, Lee.
Morning, everybody. Thanks for joining us.
I echo that. Thank you very much for everyone who's made the time to be there here. We really appreciate it. I see a lot of new names in the call today, and so I imagine some of you are wondering, who is PBC? Is this not PWC? So I'll go over a little bit around who we are and why we're here. Before I jump into that, Lee, do you want to go ahead and go through the agenda of what we're going to talk through today?
Sure. Thank you, Kate. And really, why are we here today? And firstly, it's really to unpack this concept of self-awareness and why, in fact, it is so important. And what differentiates that concept of strategic self-importance to self-awareness? And why is change so difficult? Why do we all grapple with the how? How does coaching help to develop this concept of strategic self-awareness? And then really importantly, some techniques in terms of measuring the impact of coaching, which is becoming a lot more prevalent across organizations. How does that sound, Kate?
I love it. That sounds great. And I think to add to that, we've talked about what we want to cover today, but I know when Lee and I prepared, we wanted to make sure that we also covered what you all wanted to talk about. You've made the effort to be here today, and we want to make sure it's a valuable use of your time. So to draw on the concept of setting a learning objective, I'd like you to take a moment and just reflect and consider, why did you show up on this webinar today? We all sign up for the webinars, but you actually made it onto the call. So what is it that you are actually hoping to learn from this session? If you have the means, please feel free to write it down. Better yet, you're welcome to pop it into the chat, and we'll come back to that later. But I want to make sure that we do get time for that, and we'll circle back. While you're taking a moment to reflect, I'll come back to that question of who is Peterberry Consultancy. So we are an independent consultancy that's been operating in Australia and now for New Zealand for over 30 years. We're a leading provider of the Hogan psychometric assessments, which are known as one of the gold standard assessments in the talent marketplace. We use the data from those assessments to inform our clients' talent strategies around all phases of employee life cycles, and as well to conduct our own research in terms of talent in the Australian market, New Zealand, public sector, etc. So we're bringing a lot of data onto the call. I hope you can see that today, and we're excited to share it in hopefully an engaging way. On that note, Lee, do you want to talk through in terms of how we want to run the session?
Yeah, thank you so much, Kate. Having been on the receiving end of a number of these different webinars, I often find that the real value and the gems and the collective wisdom of participants is what really adds value to the webinar. So from that perspective, really encouraging people to interact with the content, to share their perspectives and ideas as we run through the presentation. I've got our esteemed colleague Josh on the call this morning, and Josh is going to be helping curate the Q&A. We're going to hopefully have a bit of time for Q&A at the end of the session. So please, if you've got questions along the way, if you wouldn't mind just popping those in the chat, but certainly, hoping for a lot of engagement, sharing of richness, wisdom, and engaging with the content would be great.
All right. Well, thank you, Josh, in advance for manning the chat. I think you're going to have your hands full. Lee, I think we know what we're talking about, and now we know how to do it. So do you want to actually get into it?
Terrific. Let's do it, Kate.
Okay. So you and I spent a lot of time talking about self-awareness. Let's start with a really simple question. Why is self-awareness so important?
So, Kate, I don't know about you and everybody on the call this morning, but self-awareness is certainly not a new concept. It's been around for as long as I can remember, and it's been a buzzword on the agenda forever. I even go back to, Aristotle, and in those days, him coining this amazing saying where he said, knowing thyself is the beginning of all wisdom, and how powerful that's turned out to be. So certainly self-awareness has evolved over the years, but still widely recognized as that one critical leadership skill that's going to translate into high performance and leadership effectiveness. In addition to this quote, and in what we already know about self-awareness, I just wanted to reference this recent research paper that was conducted by the World Economic Forum in 2023. And here they looked at the future of jobs and did a whole bunch of research. This is widely accessible, so I encourage people to find it online and to read through it. But certainly this validates the importance of this critical skill known as self-awareness. I think in the case of this research report, the acronym VUCA is still super relevant. We know that the talent landscape and that, the economy at best is still quite volatile. There's still quite a lot of uncertainty. There's complexity. There's ambiguity. We're certainly starting to feel the impacts of AI and the digital economy. This is creating new jobs, replacing traditional jobs. But the stat that stood out was really this 25% of jobs changing within the next 5 years, which is huge. And really, this has an impact on, as organizations, that real necessity to grow and develop your talent at the risk of, business stagnation or no longer remaining relevant. And probably the most important takeaway when we're thinking about that concept of self-awareness is that the report cited that the top 10 most desirable leadership skills that translate into that effectiveness piece, self-awareness was still the third most critical after analytical abilities and creative thinking. So, based on that and what we know, it makes sense that leaders are still prioritizing this concept of self-awareness to just continue to grow, develop, and build overall leadership effectiveness.
Yeah, it's nice to see that the wisdom of Aristotle is prevailing even in the era of cryptocurrency and generative AI, that's still kind of people stay the same in terms of the core abilities that we need. But as you said, self-awareness is a term that's used a lot in a lot of different realms and definitions often. So maybe just to make sure that we're all on the same page, can you talk about what exactly is self-awareness and how do you define it?
Good point, Kate. And I think for the purposes of today's webinar, I would like to really reference the work of Dr. Tasha Ulrich. I'm not sure if many of you may have heard of Dr. Ulrich, but certainly she's no stranger to the research that she's done specific to self-awareness. Tasha is an organizational psychologist. She's a best-selling author, and she's been dabbling in the research, particularly around self-awareness, for the best part of 15 plus years. And really, over the years and during the course of her research, she has really brought to life the fact that self-awareness is actually made up of these two very distinct components, if you like. And here we'll see both the internal self-awareness component as well as the external self-awareness component. And when we look at internal self-awareness, this is really all about one's own understanding of self, one's understanding of our own thoughts, emotions, our values, our strengths, our weaknesses or opportunities. It's having a clear understanding of our beliefs, our motivations, and our core identity. It's been able to recognize our own patterns of behaviors, which are informed often by some of those strong values, and very simply put, understanding ourselves from within. If we now look at external self-awareness, This is really about understanding how others perceive you. So it's really being attuned to the impact of our actions and behaviors on others. How am I being perceived? What are people observing of some of my behaviors? And this talks to the core of reputation. This is all about reputation. And that external self-awareness piece, it's critical to be seeking feedback from others to be able to understand the impact of our behaviors. So knowing that we've got this internal and external self-awareness, this is where the core of our PBC coaching offerings uses evidence-based gold class assessments to actually build one's strategic self-awareness for that leadership impact and effectiveness. So from a Peter Berry coaching perspective, when we overlay our PBC coaching methodology over Dr. Urich's research, we start to provide insight for individuals into this notion of identity, as in internal self-awareness, and reputation, as in external self-awareness. So if we then, sorry, Kate.
Oh, I was just going to say, something that really stood out to me from Dr. Urich's research is the point that while most people believe they are self-aware, only between 10 and 15% actually met her team's definition. So it's clearly something that we need a lot of help with. So I think you're kind of leading into my next question for you, which is, we've talked about our use of psychometric tools, but I thought it'd be useful for those who are kind of new to the call to elaborate on how the Hogan assessments connect back to these concepts.
Terrific. So Kate, if we look at internal self-awareness as a starting point, that really talks to personality. And that really talks to, helping the individual to gain insight into their identity. And, universally, humans at their core are typically trying to get along. They are trying to get ahead. They are trying to find meaning in life. It's really about each and every one of us. The how we go about that becomes quite different. So really, in bringing to life one's identity, it's really enhancing that self-awareness around how am I likely to show up? How may I be similar to others, but also, and as importantly, how might I differ, and the so what in terms of what I do with that. So here at Peter Berry Consultancy, when we're talking about our coaching approach and methodology, for this personality piece, we are using the Hogan Personality Suite of assessment tools to unpack the insights for the individual in terms of how they're likely to be showing up in a workplace context, how people would be likely to describe their leadership styles, and what are some of their leadership strengths, and possibly some of the things that may be tripping them up in terms of their ability to get along with others, to get ahead. So for those of you who aren't familiar with the Hogan Personality Assessments, it's a suite of 3 inventories represented here on the screen. Each online take about 20 minutes to complete. And the Hogan Personality Inventory in the yellow, often referred to as that bright side of personality, that's the likely behavior of the individual on a day-to-day, just an ordinary, normal workday context, shining a light on their leadership strengths and how people may be perceiving them, and really probably described as the person at their best. Hence the color, Kate, so the yellow. Mm-hmm. What's pretty unique to the Hogan Suite then is the development survey, otherwise known as the dark side. And this is really taking a look at the individual potentially under stress and pressure, or alternatively apathetic and bored, and how their behaviors may change when they're potentially dropping their mask, when they're dropping that guard, when perhaps they're not emotionally regulating as effectively as on a day-to-day. So this is really going to highlight for them potentially some of those overplayed strengths that might be tripping them up in terms of their ability to get along, to be able to get ahead. And equally important, which rounds off the suite, is the motives, values, preferences inventory, which is the inside of personality. And here we're uncovering the individual's drivers, their motivations, what gets them out of bed in the morning, what's going to be important to them and for them, and even sort of taking that to the next layer of depth where we're looking at occupational preferences in terms of how that manifests in a workplace context. So this is gold when we are, supporting and working with individuals in a coaching context to help them to understand their identities, build and enhance that self-awareness piece to enable them to be able to focus in on where they'd like to sort of shift the dial.
I really agree with you that it's gold, Lee. I mean, I think back to when I was considering joining PBC, and I was debriefed on my Hogan assessments, and I learned that my main kind of dark side reaction or derailer was that high imaginative behavior, which is a lot of creativity under stress or pressure, which explains why I was, suggesting changes to the PowerPoint presentation for you for this webinar this morning, right? So I think all of us have had the privilege of having our Hogan personality assessments debriefed, have gained a lot in terms of self-awareness, but we also know that personality isn't fate. So when we're looking more at that external side of self-awareness, what do you recommend or what do you see as valuable to complement this?
Thanks, Kate. And if we shift to that external self-awareness component, it really talks to the heart of the multi-rater tools being the most effective way to measure one's reputation. Here, as I said earlier, it becomes all about other people's perceptions of us, in understanding the feedback from others in terms of what they're experiencing of our behaviors, of our style, of our impact. And it's one thing having a good sense of identity, but adding to that piece of the puzzle is the reputational piece. I might think, for example, that I'm doing a fabulous job at delegating. I feel like my delegation muscles dialed up really nice and high. But if people in a multi-rater tool context are suggesting that I'm micromanaging and disempowering my team, then perception is reality. And how do we connect the dots for people in terms of that identity and reputational piece? So looking at PBC coaching, what we use in terms of a multi-rater tool is that Hogan 360. For those of you who aren't familiar with the Hogan 360, validated, reliable, gold standard 360-degree survey based on this really simplistic but powerful leadership model that you see on the right-hand side of the screen, sort of measuring those 4 core leadership competencies. And here, sort of inviting the coachee to go and nominate a whole bunch of very critical stakeholders that are going to impact on the ability of this individual to perform effectively in the role, and to really elicit their feedback, both quantitative and qualitative, to really then benchmark and to provide them with an overall score benchmark to a large sample of professionals, here understanding that strategic self-awareness piece in terms of how others are perceiving me. So in a nutshell, Kate, if we pull that all together, what we're looking at here is PBC's coaching methodology, having that real scientific-based approach where we're using these valid and evidence-based psychometrics to bring it all together. So here we're suggesting the powerful combination of both. And you can see here how neatly all these pieces of the puzzle actually fit together. Because often, in the absence of having both data sets, there is an element missing. And as I said before, reputation is key in terms of the what. So if we look above the line, we're looking at the Hogan 360, we're looking at external self-awareness. That I often describe to individuals as the what. What are people saying about you? What are people's perceptions of your style, your impact? What are people observing of your behavior? So that's really the what. And what helps individuals to process that, or to unpack that, if you like, is in fact the why, which is the below the line identity, which comes through the personality assessments. So the really cool connection for me here is, in order to understand the what, we need the why. And having the why isn't enough. We need the what for it to be that real enhancement around strategic self-awareness. So bringing that all together helps individuals to work with their coach to really identify and articulate a very, very bespoke, tailored development plan off the back of these tangible data insights. It really takes the guesswork out of it, Kate, because no longer are you intuitively trying to think, where do I need to develop? Where do I need to push the dial? What do I need to do differently? But here you've got valid, reliable, accurate data that's translating into a very realistic, targeted development plan.
Yeah, that's a really good point, Lee. I think it's the realistic side, and it's so comprehensive. I know I've talked to a lot of people where having those two sides together is just a really powerful tool for them and hitting that deeper level of understanding. And I've had a lot of clients who come to me thinking, we only want to do one or the other, but it really is, I think you've summarized so nicely how they work best when they are used together. And by the way, I might add that's theoretically true in terms of kind of the underpinning theories that from Dr. Urich's work that you've just gone through. But I think it's cool to say as well, that's also statistically very true. One of the things that we're most proud of within the Hogan family are our correlations between the Hogan 360 and the personality assessments. Not a lot of assessment providers out there can say that they have the statistical evidence that we know that outcomes from one assessment are actually correlated with others. So a really simple example for those of you who it's been a while since you've taken a stats class. When we look at the quality of interpersonal sensitivity, right, the ability to perceive and respond to emotions appropriately, when we look at the correlations from that Hogan personality assessment scale, we can see that they're really strong when it comes to the quadrant of relationship management, right? Which just makes intuitive sense. And we would hope for that to be true. But we're very proud to have done the level of analysis based off literally tens of thousands of people's data to be able to say that that relationship exists. And then to be able to use that relationship to make some really strong guesses about people's likely performance. So Lee, clearly we've got the amazing research and the amazing data to support our understanding of self-awareness. But I'm also very conscious that understanding is only half the battle. A lot of it is being able to act on that self-awareness in a way that's constructive. And that's especially where we see people struggle. So what have you actually learned about helping people act on their self-awareness?
A very good question, Kate, and I loved you sharing the stats, by the way. I often walk past our research hub where we've got our 3 PhDs sitting in there, and I can almost see kind of the steam coming off off them when they get excited about all the statistics and the data. So yeah, thanks for sharing that. So really good question. Why is strategic self-awareness alone not enough? Kate, it's a fabulous question, and hey, having self-awareness and strategic self-awareness is in fact foundational. So that is a great starting point, and certainly a good springboard to further growth and further development. But unless you actually do something about that awareness, unless you actually action that, or build practical strategies or embed new behaviors off the back of that awareness, then it's not going to go anywhere. And that's the beauty as well of the assessment data, is that you can continue to leverage that, and you can continue to work on that over the course of any sort of coaching engagement. So why is change difficult? And we've got a couple of pointers on the slide here now, but that first one is really, one has to be open to feedback in order to embrace it. Humans are inherently quite good at shutting out any negativity. I mean, let's be honest, Kate, none of us want to hear sort of undesirable, less desirable feedback. And most of us operate in a context where no news is good news. So, being open to feedback is the starting point of actually embracing the need for change, if you like. And one of the things that I found is, often you get a lot of skeptical people out there, and a lot of people aren't necessarily sure about the value of psychometric assessments. But once they've gone through that initial Hogan personality debrief, And when they start to see the credibility and validity of how that is interpreted in a meaningful way, that resistance starts to break down, and they naturally become more open to what the data is suggesting, and the so what, if you like. Motivation is absolutely key. You have to be motivated to want to change in order to change. And understanding your impact is a really good starting point to determine the motivation for change. So if we understand, for example, that we're having a less desirable impact on our team through various undesirable behaviors, and we understand that that has a knock-on effect in terms of high performance team, then we've also got, a high score on ambition, for an example. So we want to be successful. So tying those two together, in order to be successful, I appreciate and accept and acknowledge the fact that I need to change. So the motivation's there in order to be able to achieve, as an example. Stress response is always a biggie, because as we know, and as the research suggests, when we're under stress and pressure, it's more likely we're going to default to our innate personality characteristics. We're going to drop our mask, drop our guard. We're going to go back to where we're more comfortable, and those may then resurface some of those less desirable behaviors. So it's understanding how we respond under stress and pressure, and how we moderate and adapt and dial up and dial down some of those behaviors that are going to be more effective. And then we all know that change takes time. It's all about sustainability. And, in a coaching context, your primary objective is behavioral change. So that's where, we suggest a minimum of sort of 6 sessions in a coaching engagement, because we know that during sessions, there's going to be experimentation, there's going to be reflection, there's going to be ongoing habit forming around some of those new behaviors that we want to embed. So that sustainability piece is absolutely critical.
Lee, clearly psychologically there's a lot working against us at play here. It seems a little bit like a miracle that we ever actually achieve that behavioral change, but it sounds like you were kind of going somewhere in terms of working with the coach to be successful. So can you talk a little bit more about where you see the coach's role in helping us counteract a lot of these factors?
Sure, Kate. And I think here it's really about reverting back to some structure around coaching methodology and approach. And really, now that we know a little bit more about self-awareness and strategic self-awareness, how, change is difficult, how we can incorporate some of these psychometric assessments into our process, it really starts with context. And context is key. So using, whether it's a survey, whether it's stakeholder engagement meetings, whatever that might look like, it's actually taking the time out to understand the organizational's context. We're looking at a systemic approach here. We want to understand the environment, the systems within which the individual operates, very important. And this context building piece also helps the coach in terms of their accelerated insight into this individual's world. Asking questions in this context around, what do you feel your strengths are? Where do you feel your development objectives are? Can also provide us some really good insight into the individual's level of self-awareness to begin with in terms of that identity piece. Then, of course, the powerful combination of the Hogan personality and Hogan 360 comes into play. What we really do feel that one piece of the puzzle isn't going to add as much value as having both those data sets to play with. So it's really the credibility of the data and understanding that and using gold class psychometric tools. And then we move into the next part of the equation where we're really targeting that individualized development plan. And here, the guesswork has been taken out. We've got targeted objectives based off the back of the data insights and the collective insights, and really helping the individual to articulate what that looks like. And it's a non-directive approach. It's getting them to come up with the activities and the strategies that are going to support the development of some really overarching high-level objectives. Organizational involvement is always important, and that's where we look at, you know, the executive sponsor being involved in the coaching context, where they've got some transparency and some visibility to what this individual's actually working on, where they're trying to shift the dial. That's a, you know, there's benefit to that in terms of the executive sponsor being able to encourage the coachee when they do see them experimenting and flexing their muscles, if you like, around some of those core objectives. And also the organizational sponsorship and involvement of organization helps with that ROI and overall measurement piece there as well. The committing to Kaizen, which is the final step in the wheel, if you like, is really just PBC's passion around ongoing improvement, ongoing development, that continuous measurement. You know, it's all about measuring and improving leadership effectiveness. And it's also about the being realistic about that, what that looks like for each of the individuals. And here we talk about sort of small shifts for big impact, and being very realistic in terms of how you're setting some of those SMART goals to impact change and overall effectiveness. So talking about, you know, that consistent check-in piece and that commitment to measurement, Kate, I know you've done quite a bit of research into helping to demonstrate the real positive impact that coaching has within an organizational context. And I think it's probably just a good segue now for you to share kind of your findings in that space.
Yeah, I would be very happy to. I love sharing client stories that help bring this to life. And this story particularly has stuck with me throughout my career as a good example of a lot of what you're talking about from the coaching context. One of my earlier coaching clients was referred to us by an organization. She was a high potential engineer. The organization really wanted to be able to retain her and ideally to promote her. They'd given her kind of a carte blanche option to design her next role, and they were happy with whatever she came up with. But in kind of a classic example where she was technically very strong, but she was not getting along well with her colleagues. HR was a little bit frustrated because they felt like it was every other week that she was being referred into their office for some type of conflict that she'd had with her colleagues. And for them, the objective of the exercise was really to drive home to her exactly what the impact that she was having on the team was from her behavior. Now, I guess to your earlier point, this is why it's really important to take time with that context and make sure we double down on it. Because when we actually spoke with her about her experience, a lot more important information came out. One of the biggest points was that she'd recently actually lost a parent, and she was still very much grieving that, even though she was back in the workplace. She also shared that something that had predominantly shaped her experience there was that she was the only female on the predominantly male team. And as well, that she was the only person of color or minority that was represented there as well. She felt that this kind of traditional engineering firm culture was very tough and at times bordered on bullying, and that she'd really learned to adapt her behavior to survive in that environment, but was actually questioning if she wanted to stay, if she was in the right role for her. So for her, the objective was much more figuring out, actually, what do I want to get out of my career? What is my next step? So it was useful that we had that context up front. I mentioned earlier that often clients come in and they want to do one assessment or the other. In this case, HR had been very clear that a 360 would be the way to help her understand her impact. But given all the personal turmoil that she was already experiencing, we felt that it was really important to actually start with a personality assessment and give her a chance to really feel heard and seen on a page in terms of what was important to her before we threw a lot of feedback at her from that external self-awareness side. So in terms of what we really learned from the personality assessment, it really reinforced some of the things she'd started to share with us. Some of those elements of those universal themes of wanting to get ahead with her colleagues was very much there, and wanting to do well at work. And when we looked at what was really unique to her in that circumstance, we found that she felt very passionately about engineering in the rail space specifically and enjoyed it very much. But she also, as much as she wanted to get along with her colleagues, also felt that she had a really tough time actually trusting people and relinquishing control over projects. She also shared that she'd grown up in a very demanding immigrant household where there was really high standards placed upon her, and she never really gotten over that she always felt like a failure in the workplace and really struggled to even conceive that anyone took her seriously. So we built that internal self-awareness for her, and then we switched tracks and said, all right, now let's hear what your colleagues have to say about you. And so that's when we brought in that external self-awareness through the Hogan 360. And some of the feedback was in line with what she'd already understood, but there was new insights that came through as well. So in terms of her reputation in the workforce, a lot of the feedback that came from her verbatim 360 was, she works hard. She has a lot of courage. She understands the importance of customers. And actually, she was very well respected for the knowledge and expertise she brought in. We did see that element of approachability that HR had been concerned about, that she was likely to find fault with others and potentially be accusatory. But when we looked at what were the blind spots for her, something that really came through very clearly was a very strong view in the organization that she was, in fact, a leader, and that passion was largely respected. I loved this quote from one of her managers. It said, she has the vision for her team and the organization to actually develop a sustainable and valuable plan. She inspires the people around her to unleash their potential and do what they could have never imagined. That quote just really struck me because it's an example of exactly what we want leaders to be able to do and be. And a lot of us almost never get there naturally, right? And she had that. And so by going through kind of this first assessment stage of the process, we were able to give her a much more comprehensive view of how she was seen in the organization. So that then when we came to actually working on that individual development plan, she had more ownership in terms of the goals she wanted to achieve based on that feedback. And then the coach could really lean in terms of the expertise on strategies to help her manage her own expectations and kind of quell that voice inside of her that was questioning her own worth. In this case, the consistent check-ins with the coach were really important to keep her motivation up. It can be really challenging to just rely on motivation. To some degree, we need that structure in place to help. And so having those check-ins, having a safe space to be able to vent about the emotional difficulty that she was experiencing, that she might not be able to necessarily show to her colleagues, gave her a kind of a safe space that then allowed her to park those issues and start to work forward from them. What I really liked of the outcome out of this and that kind of continuous improvement spirit that you mentioned, Lee, was that we actually identified that part of the big challenge here was the environment that she was operating in. And we looked at the culture at large, but we said what we can specifically start to shift the dial on is actually looking at the team dynamic around her, because we had identified that there was that theme of tough culture bordering on bullying in terms of how people interacted with each other. And so for this area, what actually evolved was we helped her design her role, but then we really started to work with her team to evolve their context and the way that they operate so that it could allow for more psychological safety. So in the end, I guess the happy ending there is that, to my knowledge, she's still with the firm. She was able to design a role that she found personally fulfilling, and along the way developed some skills to kind of manage her own expectations as well as how she communicated with her colleagues.
Thanks for sharing, Kate. That's such a great case study. And I know, sort of as a coach myself, it's personally so rewarding when you're working with somebody who has a bit of that sort of light bulb moment off the back of the data insights to go, wow, actually, there is this level of confidence in me that I may not necessarily have had myself, but this has really boosted my confidence and my ability to kind of stand up and lean into my role as a leader within the organization. And I love the way case studies obviously bring the methodology to life. and it just makes it real. And I love the way that you've sort of pulled that together. And I suppose that talks to, you know, one of the measures of success, and also sort of linking it to that real impact that coaching has, when an individual has that external support and that psychological safety around exploring the identity and reputational aspects of the process. So in terms of continuing with that theme around impact of coaching and, you know, organizations really being more mindful of what that is and how they can measure and gauge that, what have you found so far, Kate?
Yeah, it's a good question, because I think everyone on the call here is very on board with, we love the idea of coaching and improving self-awareness, but it can sometimes be a difficult conversation to have of actually justifying the impact or showing what it looks like. So the good news is there is so much research that has been done in this field for you, and pretty well across the board, we find positive results from the outcomes of coaching. You know, things like organizations with coaching cultures have a report generally higher revenue than those without, and definitely more highly engaged employees. So the first statistic there mentions that 62% of the organizations report themselves as engaged. Gallup finds that proportion is normally reversed, right? So globally speaking, it's usually 2/3 of employees are disengaged or actively disengaged. There's also some really promising statistics in terms of organizations being able to measure the return on investment from their coaching programs. There's, huge ranges of what that ROI looks like, but it's kind of anywhere between, I've seen 7 times to, 700 times. So there's high level versions of return on investment, but then when we also survey executives themselves, we see really positive outcomes. And I think it's important to note that's not just looking at the organizational impact as well, but we're looking at the personal impact for our employees, which I'd like to think that everyone on the call today values to some degree, which is why we're here. So we know there's a whole range of research and fields out there that theoretically back up the impact of coaching, but in my experience from talking to clients, that is a very different sell than when you're actually trying to convince someone to give you the budget to invest in a really good quality coach. So the International Coaching Federation did a survey, and they found that these were the top 3 reasons where people faced objections to actually investing in coaching and starting to build that coaching culture. And what I thought was interesting about these 3 reasons is that they're actually very closely related. You know, we know that lack of budget is rarely actually an issue of lack of budget, but it's more a question of we just don't have enough support from senior leadership to justify reallocating budget. At the same time, we know that when we don't have the right level of support from leaders, it's often because we've failed to convince them, right? We haven't shown them how impactful this can be. And so it really does come back to how well can we measure that impact of our coaching and show what the investment looks like. So what I'm hoping to round out today with is to give you some, examples that I've seen from clients in terms of what they've used to effectively have those conversations. Now, the reasons why people don't do that measuring of the impact of coaching, it ranges, but it generally falls in the it's too hard bucket, right? For some people, they're just not sure where to start. Others know that they just don't really know how to show where that's come from. For some people, they have the ad hoc feedback, but they don't really know how to translate that into an actual outcome. And for some people, they know how they could measure that output from their coaching, but they just don't have the time or the resources themselves to actually be able to follow up and show that to their clients, to their colleagues, to whoever needs to get across the line. So there's really a scale in terms of where you can start to move the dial in showing your impact. And I hope that this is feasible for you wherever you are in your practice. Probably the most baseline, simple example that you can do, and I'd hope you all are at least collecting this, is participant feedback, right? Just getting either quotes from the participant themselves or actually quantifying that. Now, it's most useful when we're doing this before and after the program, but I think this is really important to know that it can be in kind of any form that you have the means to gather. Generally, I'd say this is the easiest way to start to quantify your impact. However, it doesn't mean it has the lowest validity, right? We can't really drive home that point of what the outcomes were necessarily. Now, If we elevate that just slightly by starting to bring in some data, we can start to use tools like participant self-assessments, where we have the participant actually rate themselves quantitatively before and after the coaching program on relevant aspects. So we have some great examples of clients who've done this and assess specific behaviors that they felt were relevant to what the organization was trying to drive at the time, like being more digital or agile in their environment, more responsive to team issues. The important thing here is to make sure that it's quantifiable. That way you can actually begin to bring in some numbers here showing, we saw a 25% increase in how confident participants felt in addressing conflict, for example. And again, this doesn't have to be difficult. I've seen clients do this with, SharePoint, Google Forms, or Google Surveys rather. The validity is still relatively low because we're relying on participants' views of themselves, but at least here we're starting to get in some data, and data is really very important when we're trying to convince people. Now, if we're trying to take it up a level, the tactic I really like is, there we go, actually starting to bring in repeat 360s. So rerunning a 360 from the initial one, 9 to 12 months after you first did that, to actually be able to measure the behavioral change, not just observed by the participant themselves, but also by their raters, right? How did the people around you really see this person's behavior shift? Now, what I like about this is it's very valid, right? We've talked already about how the 360 has incredible evidence behind it to support its scientific validity. What I also love about this is it's very easy. If you can run a 360 once, you can run it again. You don't have to be out there compiling all that information. That's what you have us for, to put it together. And then we put the scores side by side on a page for you. So even a very busy executive can look at it and see what that lift looks like. Now, if you really want to get a gold star in terms of showing impact, that's when we start to look at actually correlating those 360 scores with other performance metrics. So examples of those metrics might be team engagement, operational performance, revenue or goal attainment, or a really simple one, how do we increase our retention from those coaching programs? This is a little more difficult to do. You need to have that data ideally at the leader level to be able to show what that relationship looks like. But it is, again, attainable. It's something that we have psychologists and consultants who can help you with if you need the statistical lift side or math is not your bag. But I really think this is a worthwhile investment for anyone who's trying to invest in coaching or any talent development initiative to show your organization where we're actually seeing the lift. And ultimately, what we all care about is improving our organizational performance. So yeah, go ahead, Lee.
Sorry, Kate. I was just going to say, jumping in on that repeat 360 piece, having done that numerous times as part of a broader sort of coaching program, that really provides an opportunity for the individual to assess whether the intentional energy and effort and commitment they've made in shifting the dial and that behavioral change component has in fact had a positive impact. And often, that can be very rewarding for individuals who have been super committed and motivated to change, and then seeing a comparative 360 score where the needle has gone up. And there's a real reward in that, and continues their motivation in terms of that sustainability piece. So love the way you've pulled that together.
Yeah, that is a really good point. I think often we think about showing the impact back to kind of the budget holders or key stakeholders, but arguably the most important is that participants are seeing the reward that they're getting out of the experience. So Lee, we have gone through a lot today. Do you think we should summarize it for everybody, play it back to them?
Great idea. And so really, thank you everybody for your time, for your engagement, for interacting in the chat. And before we sort of hand over to Josh to find out if there's been any questions along the way or anything that we may be able to respond to in the sort of remaining 10 minutes, just in terms of wrap up and final thoughts, we're really here just, we've covered off a lot, as Kate said. We know now that why self-awareness is so important, that strategic self-awareness, which is actually that lens of understanding oneself relative to others, is foundational for leadership effectiveness. We know that the best way to build this concept of strategic self-awareness is through the use of gold-class evidence-based psychometric data. That powerful combination between personality and 360 is gold, because that really enables behavioural change. We know it's difficult. We know it takes time. We know that we're looking for behavioural change over time, which is the sustainability piece that comes with it. And we know that coaching is in itself impactful. We've got the stats. We know that that objective coach's view, that support, that accountability, that holding them to account is incredibly effective in measuring and improving leadership effectiveness. And really, to Kate's last few slides, showing the impact doesn't have to be that difficult. It doesn't have to be that complicated. The evidence is certainly there. So on that note, thank you, Kate, and over to you, Josh, for any questions.
Sorry,
Kate.
Josh, before we do that, I just want to make a point that we know that this is difficult, right? That this is, if it were easy to do, you probably would have already done it. So what we're offering to you is that if you want to set up a consultation with us after this call, we can talk more about kind of what's unique to your coaching situation and how we can help. So for some, it might be looking into PBC's coaching services and actually using some of the methodology that we talked about today. For others, it might be that you've got a coaching practice in place, your own coaches, but you need to look at how those assessments can be incorporated into the coaching practice. And last but not least, there's a lot that we can do to support our coaches themselves. So we've got a lot available for coaches in terms of resources that integrate all of this information that we are always happy to share. So with that in mind, when we send through the follow-up from Sally Natsumi, who you've heard from already in our marketing team, we will make it available for you to set up that meeting with us and actually get more support in actually putting all of these ideas into action. So now, Josh, we'll go back to making sure that we've actually achieved what we said we would, which is meeting people's learning objectives. Did we answer questions? What have you been seeing in the chat? I've been seeing it going off.
It is definitely going off, Kate. First up, I'll say lots of positive commentary around the value of the session. So thank you everyone for attending and taking the time to post that. 3 good questions posted during the webinar today. Aaron Haining asks, which one would you choose between, if your client is wedded to one solution, between the 360 and a personality option, or how would we interrogate the client challenge to decide on which one should take precedence?
That's a great question, and I might have a first go at that, Kate.
Yeah.
So typically the short answer is it depends on context, on maturity of the leader, on what tools they're already using sort of at an organizational contextual level. But certainly what we find and what we typically suggest is going in with personality first is a slightly softer approach. And this is because the personality assessments are self-reported. And this is the identity piece. And it's really, this is the individual telling you how they're likely to show up in a workplace context. And it's unpacking and interpreting that data with them in a meaningful way, which there starts to create that level of credibility. Depending on the situation and depending on the individual, if you go in straight away with a 360, 360s we know can be very confronting for individuals, depending on what's coming through in terms of that constructive feedback element. Because you've also got the qualitative comments in the 360, those often don't land well, depending on what feedback the individual's getting. So there's got to be a level of maturity there. There's got to be a very good framing up of what we're measuring, why we're doing a 360, and the so what around that data. So certainly, you'd have to sort of gauge case by case which to use or where to start. But I hope that's given you sort of some insight there.
Aaron's replied that that's a perfect response. Thanks, Lee and Kate. Kim Coates has asked, and I believe touched on in session, but worth re-raising, what's the difference between strategic self-awareness and self-awareness?
Kate, oh, okay, sorry. I thought you asked Kate. So good point. And really, to answer Kim's question, it's strategic self-awareness is really where you have that ability to benchmark one's own identity, one's own self against the perceptions and the feedback from others. So it's one thing knowing yourself, but actually knowing how others perceive you is where the magic and the gold comes in, because that allows one the ability to then make the choice of whether to modify or adapt their behaviors to actually positively impact the situation or the context. So that strategic self-awareness is that added layer of understanding your reputation and the perceptions others have you. So it's that comparative data set that makes it the strategic piece. Don't know if you want to add to that, Kate.
No, very well said.
Thank you, Lee. This question is probably better suited for Kate, and something we may want to take on notice, and I've already provided some starting resources on. But Derek Estrop has asked, how does the Hogan 360 differentiate itself from other 360 tools, e.g. company-specific leadership model tools?
Oh, I love that question. So we've touched on it a little bit. We could probably do a separate webinar on this topic, but the Hogan 360, when we're throwing these terms around about validity and reliability, basically, the Hogan 360 has been proven to correlate with stronger leadership outcomes. So, for example, when you take an organization's competency model, unless that's been designed usually by an organizational psychologist where we know that there's evidence that that competency model correlates with outcomes, we can't really say that that competency model is going to predict success for an employee. We hope it does, but we don't really know that. When we're using the Hogan 360, we can show you the evidence to say that if someone scores well on this report, they are going to perform well as a leader. So we have that data behind it. That being said, we do offer options to customize the 360 to align back to a client's competency model. There's also a lot that the 360 brings to bear in terms of the level of information that a lot of other 360 providers don't. So actually just giving you an overall score, comparing your score to a global benchmark are simple examples. And there's a lot more that I would be very happy to share with you, but that's a good high level view of what that looks like.
Thanks, Kate. That's everything that I've picked up in the chat, but would love to open up to the forum in case there's been anything missed.
Yeah, and I'll put it back to everyone who's on the call. I mean, we really appreciate you being here, and I hope whatever your learning objective was or what you wanted to get out of this call, we did. If you're still not sure that we've answered your question, now is a great time to ask it. We're all ears. We've got 2 more minutes.
Lots of positive reinforcement on the value of the session coming up in the chat.
And I'm taking no further questions as objectives met. Kate, how about you?
Great. I'll take it. Okay. So everyone, we would love to hear from you. If you do come up with more questions later today as you're laying in bed thinking about what we talked about, please reach out to us, connect with us on LinkedIn. Lee and I are both here to help you. We're obviously very passionate about this topic, as is our wonderful host, Josh. So we look forward to hearing from you. We will share the research we referenced in the deck today in our follow-up. And please feel free to book in a meeting with Lee or myself to start to talk more about your specific coaching practice.
Thank you. Thank you, Kate. Thanks, Josh. Thanks, everybody.
Pleasure doing business with you.